Thanks. It's been a real pleasure for me to have a chance to talk with you about the Mennonites and the Amish, and I appreciate your attention and interest in the topic. And I'm going to try to. Last week was pretty much of a lecture sort of thing. Today I'm going to try to loosen things up a little bit and just talk a little bit more from personal experience and personal understanding, and try to answer your questions. And if those of you turned in questions or gave me questions, if I don't answer them, be sure to holler at me. And at any time, if you have a question, don't hesitate to stick your hand up and break in. This is going to be really informal.
Dave, sorry, can you move that mic a little closer or closer? The only reason is I'm trying to record this, but people ask me, and I just you got to have a little more volume.
Okay. Sorry. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I can be loud,
okay.
although we did a lot of singing this morning,
yeah.
So
the
voice is challenged a little bit.
Perfect.
Just to bring that, for any of you that weren't here last week, I'll just do a quick recap about the Mennonites and the Amish. They came from what would be the Swiss-German branch of the Reformation. And that, by the way, happens to be the branch that the disciples of Christ eventually followed from through the Calvinist, the Presbyterian tradition, and on down. So we're somewhat together, and you'll find that overall a lot of the theology is not that different. Because they broke off the Mennonites and the others, they were known as the Anabaptists because one of their big things was that they believed in rebaptizing or in adult baptism. They did not believe that you could be baptized as a child. You needed to be a believer. And so the Anabaptists, which means the rebaptizers, were sort of a radical group, and they had some other radical ideas as well. But they were based on probably at least 4 principles that are sort of unique. First of all was community. The idea that God's church is a community and that we all operate as a community and we work for the good of the community, not for the good of individuals. And you see that clear up today if you see Amish barn raisings and this sort of thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. A second principle that they carried out was the idea of non-resistance. And non-resistance is anything from, for obviously resistance to war. Thou shalt not kill. They took that literally. And so they were pacifists, and you'll find that several of the groups that came out of this general movement, the Church of the Brethren, the Quakers, and the Mennonites, are all pacifist churches. They're the traditional historic peace churches. And for them, the idea of alternate service, conscientious objector status, religious conscientious objector status has been carried through in our system to this day. A third one was that they take very seriously is nonconformity. Nonconformity, and they take that from a lot of places, but it comes directly from Romans 12, the first couple chapters. Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." And so they very much believe that the body is a temple of God. And so you don't smoke, you don't drink, you don't do things to your body that are harmful, because that's part of God's temple, and you're responsible. But don't be conformed to the patterns of the world. Don't be having to have the newest car or the fanciest clothing or anything, and they take it as taken a step farther in simplicity. And as we go on, and I'll talk about the individual groups, the Amish are probably they're the epitome of this and how they practice. The fourth thing the thing that really got them in trouble was that there was a very definite belief in the separation of church and state. At that time, that they were there in the 1500s and 1600s, the church and the state were one, essentially. You had the Pope, you had the Holy Roman Emperor, but the two of them, it was the responsibility of the Holy Roman Emperor to defend the Pope, and it was the responsibility of the Pope to bless and take care of all the, sort of keep the troops in line. And so it was a real thing, even though you had times where the Holy Roman Emperor or the civic people the kings were trying to get rid of the Pope, and the Pope was excommunicating the kings and all this, but overall they were tied together. So it didn't matter whether it was Catholics or the Protestants, even Zwingli and his group, they didn't like the Anabaptists because, first of all, they wouldn't fight, and secondly, they weren't going to accept the connection between the church and the state. They wouldn't go with that. So consequently, they were persecuted by practically everybody, even though they were fairly simple. And there's a lot of persecution, but they were eventually sort of driven into moving up the Rhine River. They got to the Netherlands, and one of the great leaders of the church there was a converted Roman Catholic priest named Menno Simons, and that's where the Mennonites got their name, the followers of Menno Simons. A lot of them, both because of the persecution and also because of just the devastation of the wars, the 30 Years' War, later on the Napoleonic Wars and so on, a lot of them settled right in the area of the Palatinate River, or Palatinate area right along the Rhine River. And so wars constantly went right back and forth. It was the real battleground between the Germanic people, whether it was Prussia or Germany or whatever, and France. And there were constantly battles there, and so they were getting destroyed. And the Mennonites are big on family history, but they have a real problem, a lot of them, because when the troops would come through, they'd burn the courthouses, burn the churches, and burn the records. And so, being interested in genealogy, it's really tough to trace our families sometimes because of that. Anyway, a lot of these folks ended up moving out and emigrating to the United States, particularly to William Penn's colony in Pennsylvania, which promoted religious freedom and this sort of thing. And so there were a lot of the Swiss German folks moved up the river, came across, settled first in eastern Pennsylvania. In some cases, they actually moved west to get away from the Indian problem. That sounds strange, but in the French and Indian War, for instance, there was a lot of animosity between the Delaware Indians and some of the eastern tribes. And so they moved west out into the mountains where I grew up, partly to get where there was less problem with the Indians. It was always a battle. And they were there for quite a bit of time, and they're still concentrated in Pennsylvania in several areas. And then as the process went on, they moved westward into Ohio, and then on Indiana and Iowa. And so there's a whole band across the Midwest where you'll find Mennonites and Amish communities. And the Amish were they were a group that split off from the Mennonites in 1693, led by a man by the name of Jacob Ammon. Ammon, obviously, that's where the Amish come from. And the biggest thing that they had, they believed the church, the Mennonite church, the Anabaptist church, after essentially 70 or 80 years was getting too worldly, and they were not maintaining church discipline. And church discipline is a big thing. And they practiced shunning, excommunication, or disfellowship of people and pushing it out. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But that was one of the big reasons that the Amish split off from the Mennonites, and then they later got back in again with that. There was one other group that I need to mention, and that was, there were a lot of persecution in the Netherlands and in that area, and a lot of those Low Country Mennonites ended up moving east into Prussia and then into Russia, and then when the end of the Russian Empire, and particularly pushed more by the Communist Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, they were pushed out of what is really now Ukraine, but it was part of Russia at the time. And they are known as the Russian Mennonites. And the Russian Mennonites came, a lot of them, to the prairie states and provinces, and then settled in there. Some of them went directly to Latin America, and there are large Mennonite settlements in Argentina and Bolivia, Paraguay, and they're in there, and they're scattered out throughout Latin America. And some of them ended up going from Canada to Mexico, settled in Mexico, and were there until they came back in the north into the Seminole area in the 1950s, I think, something like that, 50s and 60s, established themselves, and they're the Mennonites that you see around in Lubbock today, and they're there. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is where they came from. Our experience, or my experience, of course, I grew up in a family that my ancestors were Amish originally, and then gradually became more a little more progressive, and ended up moving to the Mennonite church and so on. What you have to understand is that when we start talking Amish or Mennonites, there is no one thing. They have very strongly held beliefs. They have generally, I would say, weak central control. You know, churches are different, and these folks consequently they have their beliefs, and they will split over minor things. And so there was a study done one time that in Pennsylvania, I think it was just in one area of Pennsylvania, there were 42 distinct Mennonite sects, or Anabaptist sects there. And there are things, and they range from, for instance, there were 3 groups of Amish in central Pennsylvania and Kishkwillikus Valley. When I was there back in the 60s, there were the black Buggy Amish, the brown Buggy Amish, and the white Buggy Amish. The white Buggy Amish were the most conservative. They would not use tractors or any powered equipment except for bell power. And so if they wanted to use their tractor, they would hitch a team of horses to it and pull it to where they wanted it, and then hook it up to a belt to run their machinery. But they would not do it. They would not, basically didn't want to ride in cars except when it was necessary. And there were a bunch of other things. Then the brown Buggy Amish were a little more liberal. They had tractors, but their tractors, and this is true, most of the Amish, their tractors could not have rubber tires. Pneumatic tires. They would have steel wheels. You don't need rubber tires. Just the basic steel wheel is fine. And that worked till they got to the point that they were tearing up the roads enough that they were finally required to have rubber. but they would go and buy a tractor with $300 tires, take it to the shop, cut the tread off, and bolt it on the wheel. I mean, so that's, and then there were the black buggies were a little more progressive. Yeah, Darla,
within each group, is there like a head, a council, or, I mean, a leader? I mean, who governs, like, if we were our own little system, our own little Amishes?
We're
like,
red buggy.
Yeah, red buggy. I mean, like, am I gonna be a leader and someone say, no, I don't want Charlie to be the leader, or I'm gonna be her counsel? How does that work?
Money.
The tradition in the Amish church and then a lot of the Mennonites up until probably the middle of the last century was that God calls leaders. The church would basically have a bishop who might serve one church or a small group of churches, probably 2 ministers and a deacon. And all of these guys were chosen by lot.
By who?
By lot.
Lot.
Not lot.
Not lot
Within the Bible. The names of the eligible young men would all be put in the Bible. And they have a service and they pray over it, and a name would be drawn. And that person would be the minister.
Okay.
And to show you, the church that I grew up in, which was a Mennonite church, it wasn't much different from this church. The ministers, the bishop and the minister in that congregation were brothers who were chosen by lot. And there's a family story that is kind of interesting. My great grandfather, back in the 1820s, 1830s, no, it's earlier than that. It was shortly after 1800. Young man, he and his family were going to move to Ohio from Pennsylvania, and he sold his farm and he got all ready to go and went to church Sunday morning, and the lot fell on him. They chose a new minister, and he was chosen as the minister. And he ended up going back, buying back his farm, and stayed there and was a minister and bishop for the next 50 years. But he had no intention of being a minister, but that's what happened. And it was also very interesting because 30 years later, my Bender, and this was the Miller side of my family, the Bender family, there was a young man by the name of Wilhelm Bender who came from Germany. He came on a ship as an apprentice or as an indentured servant to another Amish man by the name of Kinsinger, and they got to Baltimore, got off the ship. Kinsinger apprenticed this guy out to a nurseryman there to get his money back. And he headed on west on the National Road out, and he got to western Pennsylvania, and met up with this Benedict Miller, and stopped there, and he was telling this story about having this young Mennonite boy with him, and he had indentured him out. And Benedict Miller said, "We can't have one of ours indentured there." He got on his horse and rode 130 miles or whatever east to wherever this was, paid off the indenture, brought the young man back out there. And that's how the Bender family ended up out there. And the Millers, it happens that my grandfather and his brother, 2 Bender boys, married 2 Miller girls. And so
You'll probably laugh at this, but I've got a question. How will the Amish accept Vanilla Ice now that he's been arrested for burglary? Are they going to not let him come do his thing with them?
That's a tough question, and it comes to the church in general. How do you deal with people that do things that are wrong within the congregation, and that you can be excommunicated. More often, you can be shunned for certain things. And that often is more breaking what is perceived as the say that it's the theology or the doctrine, or doing things that are against the congregation. But it's interesting that particularly the Amish, in some areas, not in the area that I grew up, but some of the Amish sort of have a deal. Since you become a member of the church by believer's baptism at a certain age, you have to, up until that point, you're not a member, and there's a period of time in there that a lot of the young men go out, frankly, and sow their wild oats. And there are places, there's a spot in little place in Sarasota, Florida, that has sort of a reputation that the Amish young men all come down there, and they're out walking around drunk and good.
Spring break.
Oh,
Yeah, it's basically
spring break.
Amish spring break. But they do that, but then and it's free will on whether you join the church or not. And probably roughly 20% of the Amish don't choose to join the Amish, come back and join the Amish church.
I've got two questions before I forget.
Okay.
During church, would you all have communion? Did you have church on Sunday?
We-
have communion?
Yeah,
And
our
money,
church-
what'd you do with did everybody pile their money and
Okay.
what you work into one account?
no,
Or each family have their
okay.
own money, like she's got more money than he has, or, I mean, how'd that work?
She does, she's always had.
the Mennonites, and again, it really would be pretty much the same. As far as money, they handle their money just the same as anybody else. It's private. They won't hold it. Now there is a group, one of the groups that formed in Germany, or in Switzerland, back in the early part, got persecuted, moved to Moravia, and then moved to the United States, and there are other places too, called the Hutterites, who were followers of Jacob Hutter. And the Hutterites believe in Christian communism kind of thing. They share everything. They follow the early church model that everybody puts their things together in, all their money and their stuff together.
So you would just tithe during church?
We would,
Okay.
and we had church every Sunday. Mennonite church that I grew up in celebrated communion twice a year.
Really?
And we had communion. It was a special service, communion and foot washing. We would do foot washing twice a year. But there was also, when you had if you were having a communion service, you also had a preparatory service on the Thursday night before communion on Sunday. And that was the time that you came and got together and got yourself right and worthy to receive communion. And if people would, if it was a time of confession, either public or private. And so that was really important. The Amish, basically, they like to have their simple dress. A lot of the men will not wear belts. They're a little flashy, just wear suspenders. Simple clothing, straight coats with no collar. They really look very much like the Nehru jackets from back in the 60s. And they have that. Then as you go up the line, the group that broke away from them first was, or there's a group that broke away in our chain that are considered the conservative Mennonites. Those guys would still wear straight coats. They had a little stand-up collar. There are all these little different things, and they had cars, and the Amish didn't have cars, and it's different. But a couple things that the Amish do that are different from from the Mennonites, number one, they don't believe in insurance. The community takes care of somebody. So if your barn burns down, the community is responsible for getting you back on your feet.
Wow.
And so they don't do that. Of course, they don't do military service. They don't do a lot of these things.
Healthcare too?
Healthcare, they will take care of healthcare within the community pretty much. They don't, while they don't have insurance and they don't go out of their way with healthcare, they do a lot within the group, but they aren't opposed at all to going to the hospital or this sort of thing. But one of the things that's interesting is because they're such an inbred group, they're a wonderful study for all sorts of genetic studies and genetic diseases that show up and this sort of thing. And they're very cooperative in working with that.
Wow.
When you get to other groups, I had several questions about the Mennonites here, why the men dress normally and the women, always have to wear the funky dresses. And all this sort of thing. And that, I don't know exactly why that is characteristic. You'll see that more in the German, or I mean the Russian Mennonite community than you do in the Swiss-German Mennonites. Somebody had asked about languages and so on. They all speak or they pretty much use a dialect of German. Most of the Swiss German ones in Pennsylvania speak a version of Swiss German, which they refer to as Hochdeutsch, which is High German, because it was up in the mountains. The Russian Mennonites speak a version that is what they call Plattdeutsch, which is Low German. And so Pennsylvania, you hear about Pennsylvania Dutch, that's generally the Hochdeutsch language. And of course, got to realize that both of these have been filtered through various other languages, other countries and other cultures and so on. And so it's pretty amazing that they've been able to keep that. And most of them also speak, they're fluent in English. They believe in education. They're fully supportive of education, but you only need about an 8th grade education to be an Amish, do everything that an Amish person's supposed to do. So they cut it off at 8th grade for the most part, and so they don't go on beyond that point.
So were you encouraged by your family to go on to college, or was that just something personally that you wanted to do?
No, I was encouraged to do that. The Mennonites, on the other hand, have had a longer tradition of higher education. They have a series similar to what the disciples have of colleges around it and universities around the country. But don't have too much in graduate education, but they're mostly liberal arts schools, but they're trained. I had a couple of questions about Dawn and I and why we were, where we came from. We both grew up in what would be traditional Mennonite communities. Not a lot different from here, although in the churches when I was growing up, women were required to have their head covered in prayer. The Amish have their head covered all the time. They'll have, they wear you see the black bonnets, but they always wear a prayer covering, a little white lace deal. The Amish will all have strings. At some point, when you get progressive enough, you don't have the string. But and some of them, some of the Russian ones will wear like a mantilla instead of the covering. So Dawn started out wearing covering and hated it up until she got out of the house and her mom wasn't there to make her wear it.
What drew you all to the disciples?
Well, let me finish. I'll go with my story. Dawn and I were in the Mennonite church, married the Mennonite church, moved to Virginia and worshiped in the Mennonite church. When I went to graduate school in Blacksburg, there were no Mennonite churches there. And so we ended up joining Church of the Brethren, which is very closely related in a lot of the same things, except that they had instrumental music. The Mennonite churches traditionally are a cappella singing. And then when we moved to Lubbock, there weren't any Churches of the Brethren, there weren't any Mennonite churches. And I asked my Church of the Brethren pastor, who was a good friend, I said, look at this list of churches, where would you start looking for a church? Because, you know, Lubbock, the city of churches, there's a list like this. And he said, you know, I think if I were going out there to that situation, I would look at the Disciples of Christ.
Oh, wow.
And so we came and we visited about, I think, every Disciples church in town, and ended up at that time at Westmont. And we were, because they really had a good kids program going at that point, and that was sort of the time that First Christian was having internal problems, and there were a lot of folks moving, and so Westmont was growing exponentially and so on. And so that, it really is, you know, was nothing that we rejected the Mennonite thought, it's just that we ended up choosing to do this.
Well, we're glad you're here.
So, let's see if there was anything else that I left. Oh, somebody asked about the Amish Mafia. Anybody seen the Amish Mafia reality show?
No.
I've heard of that.
No, it's a reality show based on, it really was triggered by an issue that they had in the church in Ohio, where the bishop got mad and or one group got mad at the others, and they went and cut the beards off some of their neighbors, which is, you know, Amish men, when you join the church, you grow a beard. No mustache, just a beard. And so there was this big deal, and so they started, you know, the wheels started turning, and suddenly you have, you know, boss Schwarzenegger and this sort of thing.
Don't shave your beard off.
But it really bears, I mean, the Amish and the Mennonites are not perfect. They're not much different from anybody else. But in the grand scheme of things, that is just totally blown out of proportion. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That's a reality.
Yeah, it's an unreal reality show, like most of the others.
Well, they got the governor of that state involved, they were talking about.
Are the Shakers in any form or fashion an offshoot or anything in relationship, because they were a real strict sect as well?
Yeah, no, there may have been a little bit of connection because in there, but they were a completely different, I mean, their motivation or their background was a different, completely different deal, and I'd have to go back and study that.
Is the concentration here mostly in Brownfield, Denver City?
Yeah, it's in Gaines County was sort of the epicenter, and a lot of them were brought in as farm workers initially, but they found out that they're also very good carpenters.
Boy, they take care of their fields when they've got a stand.
Yeah, they're good farmers and good people.
A lot of Spanish.
Yeah, they speak, a lot of them speak Spanish, German. They speak Spanish, German, and Plattdeutsch because they learned Spanish. They learned Spanish when they were in Mexico. Of course, picked up English here, and they do Plattdeutsch. And most of the Amish churches still do their worship in standard German. Wow. So they also have to at least be able to read. At least the leaders have to be able to read German as well. So, well, if anybody wants to go to second service, we better get out of here. I'm going to run too long. I'll be glad to stay and answer any questions. I can go on for hours. But if you've got questions now or later, I'll be glad to help you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to me.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you.